It's episode 86 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Hank. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. You can even listen on your PC. That's audibletrial.com/Hank. We've got a really exciting episode for you today. I'm joined by Hank Schwaeble, author of the new book American Nocturne. Hank and his publisher Cohesion Press have graciously donated a Kindle e-ink reader preloaded with American Nocturne and the entire catalog of ebooks from Cohesion Press. So if you'll go to the show notes for this episode, which is hankgarner.com/AN, which is short for American Nocturne, and leave a comment. There's instructions on the bottom of the post there on what you need to post. And you can be entered in the drawing that will happen next Friday, February 19th. So go check out the show notes. While you're there, subscribe to the show. And thanks for listening. Now on to my interview with Hank Schwaeble. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. I'd like to apologize off the bat. I'm struggling with a horrible cold today, but I hope that we'll not make the listening audience think about it too much. I have a very awesome guest with me today. We are a very unique and special club of people named Hank. And I'm very excited to have Hank Schwaeble with me on the show today. Hank is an author of horror and thriller, and he has a new collection out called American Nocturne. And right before we started recording, I told Hank that I'm a little ways into it, and it's already scaring the crap out of me. So I hope that everyone will pick it up and check it out and enjoy it as much as I am. But welcome to the show, Hank.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Super excited to have you on the show today. I've not had the opportunity to interview that many horror writers, and I'm always excited to talk about this genre. It is we'll just get into it in a minute. I'll pitch the questions to you that I have in a minute, but I'm sorry?
We tend to skulk around in the shadows. So
That's right. Before we get into all that, I start every episode with a variation of the same question, and that is, how did you first know that you wanted to be a writer or a storyteller?
Well, that, like with most writers, that goes back to childhood. I remember quite vividly devouring Edgar Allan Poe stories, which they taught to school children back in the day. I'm not sure they still do that, but I really, really was excited when we'd have an Edgar Allan Poe story to read when I was in grade school. And that certainly got me started thinking that way. I was a big comic book devourer. I'd say collector, but I didn't treat them very well when I was a kid. And, comic books were a great entry level piece of literature into fantasy, the world of fantasy, the world of possibilities. And I read a lot of Edgar Allan Poe stories, and then when I got a little bit older, I remember when I first read Night Shift by Stephen King, and that really got me thinking. I remember when I read Night Shift, that really got me thinking. I had dabbled in writing short stories, for school, and I enjoyed it, but that got me thinking about being a writer. And then a few years later, I picked up, if you remember, Clive Barker's Books of Blood.
Yeah.
And those anthologies, collections came out, and I remember that was when I decided. That was when I decided, I wanted to write. And there's two points, I think, in most writers' lives when they that they go through. One is deciding they want to write, and one is making the decision to be a writer. And those are kind of two different things.
They are.
I decided I wanted to write then. I remember that when I read the Books of Blood, because it wasn't just Stephen King anymore. Stephen King, I really, really liked Night Shift. I was so entertained. I loved the whole horror short story dynamic. It was so versatile. It was so energetic. It was so hard hitting because of its economy and compact, format. And he seemed to be the only one since Edgar Allan Poe that, as a little kid, I knew about. And then when I read Clive Barker and how eloquent his prose was and how intense his stories were, I remember that's when I decided, I wanted to be a writer. The decision, though, to actually become a writer, that was many years later. And, the word decision, has that root of to cut, the size root, like incise or scissors, that root is in there. And a decision is when you cut off all options. That's what a decision is. And so, I made the decision to become a writer much later when I realized, at some point I got to actually do it. You can't just go around saying, yeah, someday. And I'm an adult. I had, graduated from law school. I was, well into my years of having a career, and I just had this sudden feeling like, this is going to all slip away from me unless I actually go and do it. So I just set my mind to it, made that decision then to become a writer later on. But definitely those two works, Night Shift and Books of Blood, stick out in my mind. They weren't the only books I'd ever read, of course, but they were definitely ones that just planted that seed, that I really wanted to be a writer.
Yeah. Did you ever consider writing in a different genre?
Oh, sure. Horror is a very challenging genre to write in for a couple of different reasons. One, the short story, I think, is the best vehicle for a horror tale. Horror has to maintain a level of intensity, a suspension of disbelief, an immersion in a very surreal sometimes world, that it can be very draining on a reader. So a short story is a very good format, I think, to and a very versatile format too, to convey that kind of entertainment. That's not to say there aren't great horror novels. There are, but it's a very challenging format to write a novel in. That's why I don't think you see as many great horror novels as you do in other genres. It's just a hard translation there. But for that reason, I certainly contemplated. I am right now, I will confess, about a third of the way into a straight thriller I'm writing that I'll be turning into my agent in a few months. And that's got no supernatural or horror element to it at all. You could argue there's a little needy science fiction in it, but not really. It's a straight thriller. I love thrillers. I love crime novels. I love noir. I love science fiction. But my first love, I always go back to is horror. And the dates with horror were always in the short story, arena. And, from when I was a kid. And so that's always going to be my first love. My first two novels, Damnable and Diabolical, were horror, but, to really be appropriate for a novel format, I had to make them structured like supernatural thrillers, which they are, but they certainly contain horror elements. Like I said, pure horror is very hard to accomplish in a novel format in a way that is going to keep the reader engaged and entertained. So the answer is yes, I have entertained it, and I am, in fact, writing one right now that's a thriller.
Yeah. Well, like you talked about, that horror is really well suited to the short story because like you said, you've got to maintain that tension, and you've got to maintain that certain level of exhilaration, and you're, as a writer, really playing with the reader's adrenaline and kind of keeping their senses peaked, and that's very draining on a reader, to go 600 pages with your adrenaline at max output. So I would imagine, I've not written a horror novel, but I would imagine that when you start taking on a long form piece like that it probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that that novel becomes a series of scenes and pieces that read more like a series of short stories where you can take the reader up and down, up and down. Do I have that right? Well,
that's the danger. That's actually the danger. You don't want plot to be episodic, I think is the word.
Okay.
You want the narrative to be dramatic. And so the challenge, to use that word again, is to fit the appeal of horror into the structure of a novel. Now, a novel to me is a character journey. Okay, that is why we follow a character or set of characters, through trials, tribulations, travails, through what we call a plot.
Right.
Now, the plot is a very important part, obviously, of the structure, but the key is the characters there. And so what you have to do, I think, is just take the basic structure of a novel, the framework of a novel, and the character arc and dynamics of a novel, and you work in the horror theme, the horror plot elements, the horror antagonisms, that you would find in short stories. But the thing about a short story, it's not only the short format. I mean, that's a big part of it, just like you said, and I totally agree with that, echoing on what I had said earlier about how you have to sustain a high level of tension and dread, lots of suspension of disbelief. Certainly those lend themselves better to a shorter format. However, there's another element too, and that is a short story does not have quite the same rules. A novel, because you're asking for such an investment of time, it needs to have a certain familiar structure. It needs to have a symmetry to it because you're expecting a reader to settle in for the long haul there. You can have experimental novels. You can have unusually structured novels, but at the end of the day, most of them are going to have to adhere to within certain parameters of a structure that is, been evolved over centuries, and there's a reason for that structure. Short stories don't have quite those restraints or constraints. You can start a short story in the middle of something. You can have a short story that doesn't really have a plot.
Right.
It's what is called just a situation reveal. And that is the beauty of the short story when it comes to horror. It gives you that flexibility to explore all those strange, unusual, bizarre, alluring little quirks of your imagination in ways that you just really couldn't get away with in a novel. And so that's why I like it. It gives you that freedom to bring out the elements that are horrific. Horror is a broad genre, and the term horror is in many cases a misnomer because it encapsulates a lot of things that aren't just pure horror. It scares and thrills and mystery and intrigue and luridness, that all wrap up into something that I'm sure when you sit down and read a scary story, there's this little tingle of thrill you just don't get with other stories.
Right.
It's this peek behind the curtain. And that's why I love the short story for it, because you can give that glimpse. It's that glimpse of another little underworld, that behind the dark shadow, what's going on in the darkness there. You can do that from so many different perspectives. And I don't mean point of view perspectives. I mean from structural perspectives with a short story. And that's why I like the short story format so much. I love novels. I devour novels. I am never without a novel, that's, I'm some ways into at some point. I mean, as soon as I finish one novel, I start the next one. So I love novels, but I'm just trying to be intellectually honest here. And that is that horror, is in its purest form, I think suited best for the short story. And that's why I think you see so many really good horror writers write horror short stories, whereas you don't see that in other genres necessarily. And it's because their devotion to the art, whether they consciously know it or not, they just realize that this is the purest, manifestation of their craft here, this short story structure. And I certainly think that way. So I'll always love the short story.
When I was younger, I didn't like horror so much. It was, to be honest, it scared me, and I went through a period when I was a kid where I was a very scared and skittish kid, and the last thing I wanted to do was to read things that made me more so that. As I've gotten older and grown up and have a family of my own and all that sort of stuff, I have kind of gravitated toward things that uh, that scare me a little bit, things that explore the themes of, the things that hide in the dark that we can't explain. And what do you think, as a writer and as a lover of horror, what is it about us that likes to be scared a little bit, and what is it about these kinds of stories that intrigue us about the things that we don't understand?
Well, I think that last thing you just said is the key. It lets us explore things that we don't really understand, possibilities. True horror always has to come back to the human element, the character that's not the monster. It's always got to come back to that, because it's what we're revealing about us. It's what we're revealing about human nature that matters. It's not what we're revealing about the vampire or the demon. It's what we're revealing about humans, about people, through their reaction to it, through how they deal with it. It can be very symbolic, very metaphoric, and I think it's a great tool to explore things that we just don't get to explore in other areas. The idea of being scared, being behind the horror genre, obviously horror stories should be scary. That's almost a truism or given. But that has caused horror to have a problem. And here's my opinion on that. At the risk of alienating some of my colleagues, or some of horror aficionados, there's a lot of bad horror out there. There's just a lot of bad horror. And this is why I think that's the case. It's because being scared is something that you learn to either, revel in or avoid as a little kid. And a lot of little kids enjoy being scared. And because a lot of little kids enjoy being scared, a lot of horror becomes popular. Certainly prior generations horror becomes popular among very young kids, 10, 12, 13 years old. They're watching older horror movies and getting a little thrill out of it. And I think that has created a situation where a lot of people believe that horror is geared toward a childish mindset. And so a lot of people don't take horror seriously. I think the pedigree in literature of horror totally disproves that. If you go back and read Edgar Allan Poe, two stories come to mind, Cask of Amontillado and The Telltale Heart. Those are brilliant works of literature. I mean, absolutely brilliant. If you read his prose and his exploration of the psyche of his characters, he's writing these in the 1840s. It's just, holy cow. When you think of that, nobody else was doing that. This is a guy... He was
credited with starting an entire genre.
Two.
Yeah.
He had started the modern horror story and the modern detective story.
Right.
That's a... Wow. Either one of those, you could drop your mic and go home. But, he really, really was somebody we owe a debt to. All of literature does. But unfortunately, a lot of horror is, I don't want to say it's played off for laughs, although that happens too, but it's misunderstood. It's thought of as juvenile, even subconsciously, if not consciously. And it's also goes for the gross out a lot. It goes for some cheap titillation. And always lurking in the background is this idea that really it's not to be taken seriously. It's childish. Now, that doesn't mean horror shouldn't be fun, but I definitely think it is entitled to and should receive as serious a treatment as any other genre. And I think many, many authors do this. I'm not, trying to say that nobody writes serious horror, but that's what separates the wheat from the chaff here is, you take a Richard Matheson or somebody like that, he understood that. He treated it with the deference that it deserved. Stephen King, certainly had elevated the horror story to its commercial potential. And he did so, by understanding that even as quirky, as a lot of his characters were, and as sometimes going for the gross out as he was wont to do, he understood that, that at its core, it was something to be taken seriously, and that respect for it, resonated in his readership. And any of the other very iconic horror writers you can name, they'll have done the same thing. Unfortunately, and I think this is mostly a product of people learning or absorbing what they think horror is through watching cheap movies. I think I think a lot of people just didn't quite get that memo. And so what makes horror horror? It's what I think of horror. I think of something that involves something that is a threat that is out of the ordinary and beyond, normal everyday ability to comprehend as to how it could exist. And that can even be a serial killer. That some serial killers, lend themselves to just straight detective mysteries or thrillers. Some, like in The Silence of the Lambs, are very much more horror, and that has to do with just how complicated and malevolent are the forces acting in this mind. That's a very terrestrial, very human confined force we're talking about here, but it's still got that creepy aspect of like, wow, that guy has evil going through his veins and his mind, and there can be real people like this who really exist. That makes it horror. But of course, the supernatural element adds that other dimension of things that could be out there, things that could be lurking in the dark, and are a threat to us. But like I said before, it always has to come back to the human element and how we react to it and what it says about us, what these things that we worry about and scare us say about us, about our culture. And, it allows us to explore aspects of human nature that you really don't get to explore in very other contexts.
Yeah. When you're writing horror, what is you talked about people not taking it seriously and trying to, kind of go for the childish, campiness, and there's, dozens and dozens of cheap horror films that come to mind when you think of that. But the other side of that, and you alluded to a little bit with the, going, for just kind of the over the top gory, there seems to be a trend in horror where it's like we feel like we can't shock people anymore, so we just keep going more and more over the top. And who can be the most disgusting? Who can be who can think of the most depraved thing that we can come up with? And you start getting this diminishing returns. Well, I can't scare people enough, so instead of crafting a serious exploration of evil, and what it means to be human in the face of evil, we just go more and more disgusting and over the top. So my question is, how do you balance scary versus gory and keep your maintain that tension without just going to the least common denominator?
Well, it's easy to get lazy. It's easy to go for the cheap shock. You do have the phenomenon of that one-upsmanship, that people try to go the next mile, the next length, farther, to just show they could do more, or be more shocking than the people who came before them. You do have to guard against that. I am not opposed to gore, if it's presented in its proper role, or that's maybe not the right way to put it. It comes down to whether it's earned, because the story is the boss. Okay, the story is the boss. What happens in a story happens because of the characters. And whatever happens needs to be compelled by the circumstances and by the personalities and by the motivations and by the wills of the characters that are involved. And sometimes that'll call for a very hardcore graphic scene. But you have to earn it. You have to get to that point by earning it with your characters. Building the tension to a point where the only possible, realistic, for a literary setting, way to release that tension is through something gory like that. Not just going for the cheap splatter. And what you're describing really is its own kind of cross-genre, which is splatter. I mean, you have splatter movies that are war movies. You have splatter movies that are police procedurals. You have splatter certainly that are horror movies. It's not just horror. Splatter, occurs a lot. I'm not one who thinks you need to shy away from violence. I think you need to make sure that it's earned. It's earned. Every story has to have the component that it deserves of that kind of thing, if it's there at all. So yeah, I wouldn't back away from it. I wouldn't not put it in there if it needs to be in there just because you're worried that, wow, this is going to be gory. Sometimes it's going to be called for. It's horror. People are going to have, the signal, to be aware that there's a possibility of that. What I don't like though is what you might call wet horror, which is, if not done well, is really just a gore fest and just an exercise in creative, gore description. That's not my cup of tea. Some authors out there have done it pretty well. There's no question, but, you don't want it gratuitous. You want it to be necessary. You want it to be something that affirms some aspect of the story or the character, or that, there could be nothing short of that, that the story calls for. A good example in the movie realm, is you had Hostel, that movie. You remember Hostel?
Right.
The Eli Roth movie. Everybody focused on the gore. And the reason people did, on the violent torture gore scenes, the reason people focused on that was when CGI first really made its presence known in the ability to do things on screen that you probably couldn't get away with doing before without it looking really cheesy. That was right around there, and Eli Roth took advantage of that. But what was lost in all that discussion of what they called torture porn, was the fact that was a really good movie. That was a very Hitchcockian movie with a gripping plot, and that kind of got lost in the discussion. A lot of that was because a lot of people tried to jump on that bandwagon and did not do it nearly so well, and Hostel kind of got tagged with being the poster child for it, when that's a little undeserved, because that was a good movie. But I don't know that Eli Roth went overboard in his gore in that movie, given what the story was and what the point he was making was. But he certainly did lose, I think, some of the attention or shift some of the focus from what would have been more, I think, appropriate to focus on in that movie, and that's a shame. So you have to be very careful. You have to be very careful with your use of gore, judicious, not necessarily stingy, but you just got to make sure, I always want to ask myself the question, did I earn this? Did this story earn it? Is this earned, when I do something like that? Or am I just throwing it in there because it's an easy way to get people to gasp and kind of mask maybe some deficiencies, in the story otherwise, that would not be gripping, or holding their attention. So it's a tool, it's an arrow in the quiver, but, be careful. Be careful with it because, it can be one that, leaves a mess and not just the gore on the floor from your story.
Right. And like you said, that the story at its essence needs to be a story about characters. And, if we haven't built, enough rapport with the reader and enough, if they don't have a connection with this character, then just splattering blood everywhere is not going to have a lasting effect. It needs to have, this needs to be something that we care about happening to the character.
Absolutely. I agree. And, that care does not need to come from, reams and reams of pages and, gallons of ink building up to that. It just has to be done in a way that, even if it's relatively soon into the story or into the scene, it's still got to be done in a way where it's compelled by the particular story and by that particular scene, and fits with what the characters are made of. And you have to balance it. You have to keep asking yourself, is this too much? Is this what the story calls for here? It's an art. This isn't a science. It's an art when it comes to that kind of thing. It's a judgment call. It's like Justice Potter Stewart said, what's the definition of pornography? When somebody asked him, he said, well, I know it when I see it. It's that kind of thing. I know it when I see it, but I can't explain exactly how to do it or how I would do it. And I'm sure, it's not like I'm perfect. It's not like I know that every time I nail it and do it just right. It's just the question I keep asking to keep that fine-tuning edge there while I'm writing a story so that I don't go overboard with it or use it as a crutch.
Yeah. Let's get back for just a minute to your story. You grew up as a fan of horror and other types of genre literature. You grew up and you started pursuing a career like most of us do. Went to law school and kind of began your life, but then it kept nagging at you that you wanted to do this. Kind of walk us through that first novel, and what was that first crack at it like for you, and how did you kind of get over that hump and say, okay, this is something I can actually do?
Well, I was probably in college, I think, when I read Books of Blood by Clive Barker, and that's when I, like I said, made that decision. I wanted to be a writer. Unfortunately, that kind of decision, it was semi-liberating and also complacency-inducing because, I had this idea, okay, someday I'm going to be a writer. And then I went on with my life. So I graduated from college. I went into the Air Force. I was an Air Force officer for about 5 years. I was a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, which you and some of your listeners may be familiar with. If you remember the OSI from the $6 Million Man, you remember that TV show, The $6 Million Man?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was the organization I was in. I was an OSI agent. In fact,
nice.
As a little aside, if you remember Oscar Goldman, the director of OSI, that was an actor named Richard Anderson, and he actually did training videos for us because he thought it was so neat. There was a real OSI. He volunteered to do training videos for us. And so we had some classified training videos I remember watching from him. They just say, where he would say, "Hi, I'm Richard Anderson. You may remember me as the director of the OSI."
That's so cool.
That was, so I did, I went in the Air Force, like I said, and I was a special agent. That was a great opportunity for a writer, believe me, to have that experience. And then I went to law school, and it was right after I got out of law school that I was probably a year out that I took a breath, took stock, took a measure of the environs around me, and thought to myself, I really got to start writing if I'm going to keep thinking someday I'm going to be a writer, or if I'm ever going to actually be a writer, not just keep thinking someday I'll be a writer. So I sat down and I started, like most writers do, started really seriously trying to write. And my first attempts, I'm sure, were, quite clumsy, overwritten, puffy, the normal types of deficiencies you'll find in amateurs writing. But I kept at it. And I sat down and I wrote a novel called Apocryphon. I published a short story. I did publish a short story, but and I sat down and wrote this novel that was going to be for a 2012 novel, an apocalypse novel called Apocryphon. And while I think it was a neat idea that I had, it was somewhat of a mess. Because I was trying to do too much, trying to have too novel, pardon the pun, an approach to the structure. That ended up going nowhere. I just never was quite satisfied with it. I never really, people were very put off by the awkward structure that I thought was, very creative, but, everybody was like, well, you're a first time writer. You can't just reinvent the novel, which they were, I'm sure, correct about. So I then dabbled, started another novel, just, kind of just hemmed and hawed around thinking, what am I going to do? And then I just sat down one day and I thought, I need to have more focus on when I'm sitting down to write these novels. I need to actually not just treat this as an organic exercise. I need to treat it as a task. It's creative, obviously, but it's as just like a work task. I have a goal. Something I have to accomplish here. So I need to focus my energies more efficiently here. So I sat down, I remember, and thought, what do I really want to write a novel about? I couldn't think of anything. I couldn't think of I had so many things, I couldn't really pick one. So I just sat down and I wrote an opening scene. And the opening scene, I wouldn't say it wrote itself, but it certainly came easy because I had no pressure on me at the moment. Because I thought, let me just write something here. And I wrote this opening scene. I sat down, I read it, and I thought about it. And that's when it occurred to me what this opening scene would be. And I thought of this character that This was in the mid the 2000s. I thought of this character who was an Iraqi war veteran, special forces interrogator. Because as an OSI agent, I was very well trained in interrogation, so I knew a lot about it. Something I was very familiar with, and so I had this idea of a field interrogator, a very black ops type field interrogator, who was a specialist in coercive interrogation tactics. And that he had been kind of at the time, I could see the political winds were shifting. That there was a revolt against the idea of torture, the idea of what they called enhanced interrogation. There was a backlash against it, and as you predict, the government immediately sticks its finger out and sees which ways the wind is blowing and starts hanging people out to dry. And so I just had the idea of this is one of the guys who was hung out to dry. He was doing his job, and now he's politically expedient to sacrifice. And that's where the idea for the title came from, Damnable. They needed somebody who they could damn, and he was damnable. And but it's more to it than just damning him by betraying him. The whole idea of somebody who's trained and charged with extracting information by coercive means, by torture, is basically damning that person. So I had it to where he had selected, not because, he was this great soldier, not because of all his potential. I mean, he was obviously a smart and capable guy and suited for special forces, but because he was estranged from, his very meager family, had no connections, no girlfriend, nothing. He was damnable. He was somebody that they could sleep at night knowing, okay, this guy's going to hell, because we need somebody. And so, that was where the idea came from. And of course, having that kind of character then, disgraced, kicked out of the military, and then thrust into a situation where he is basically the only thing standing between, the world and hell, I thought was a little bit poetic. So, that's how I sat down and I wrote Damnable. And, it was purchased by Penguin, which was, very gratifying. In fact, some people were stunned that a first novel could be a horror novel. First horror novel would be purchased by Penguin. And, followed it up with a sequel, Diabolical. And, that was the two novels I've written so far. I have a third in the series coming out, this summer called The Angel of the Abyss. It's another Jake Hatcher novel. And, it's had a very strong response from people who've looked at it, and I'm happy Cohesion is going to be giving us a pretty big release later in the year. I'm not sure if it's going to be in June. That's what they're trying to see if they can get it out with the proper release for, but it might be a little more toward the fall. But sometime this summer, early fall.
I'm going to pause our conversation with Hank for just a moment to tell you about Audible.com. For you, the listeners of the Author Stories podcast, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a 30-day free trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. All you have to do is go to audibletrial.com/Hank, sign up for a free 30-day free trial, download a free audiobook on them and me, and if you like the service, then just continue your subscription. And if you don't like the service, you can cancel it anytime, and you don't even have to pay for the free book that you've got. Each week I give you a personal recommendation of a book that you can get from Audible, and this week that recommendation is V-Wars Night Terrors. This is an audiobook by Jonathan Mayberry. It's a collection of stories from the Vampire Wars. There's a huge war between vampires and humans, and each one of these stories is from a reporter who's embedded with either the humans or the vampires. It's crazy when you don't know who the vampires are, who the humans are, and people can turn at any moment and appear. This is a fascinating collection of stories by a huge cast of narrators, and I think you're really going to love it. So that book is V-Wars Night Terrors, and you can get that free by going to audibletrial.com/Hank. Now, back to our interview with Hank Schwaeble. What a great play on words for the title for Damnable. That's I love that whole concept. That's so awesome.
Well, thank you. I like it.
Yeah, I'm adding it to my Kindle right now as we talk. So, yeah, it sounds amazing. I can't wait to get into it. So how long did that first novel take you to write? And also I wanted to mention, I think that happens to a lot of us, that there's kind of this pressure to come up with a great idea. Man, I really need to get something out, and it needs to be the perfect setup and the perfect idea, and then you sit down and just nothing,
Right.
until you kind of remove that pressure and just find a character and then discover what their story is. So I love that you brought that up, because I think that happens to a lot of us.
There's a
But how long did it take you to write that?
I'll tell you, there's a reason writers are neurotic, okay? we have to face a lot of competing, conflicting, and contradictory sometimes risks and challenges and forces, while we're trying to pursue this rather screwed up avocation here. It took me, it depends on how you look at it. From the time I started writing it till the time I had a draft manuscript, I would say it was about 12 months. Maybe 12,
Okay.
12, maybe 14, but I think it was around 12 months. How long did I actually?
Which is really ambitious for a first novel.
I actually probably wrote it in 9. But I had, I was a full-time practicing lawyer. I still am. But, at the time, it could be a challenge sometimes, to get the kind of time. But you learn as a writer. You can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Okay.
That's right.
You can't always have 2.5 hours of isolation tank, privacy, where nobody's going to disturb you. Nothing else is on your mind. You'll never get anything done. When I was in college, I had a very good creative writing instructor, who said, writing is work. He used to always say that. Writing is work. Writing is work. And what I come to learn is that's true, but it doesn't go all the way. Writing is, to me, 2 things: work and habit. There are a lot of writers out there who will work hard, but they don't have it as a habit. And here's an example. I've known people who said, wow, I wrote 12 hours over the weekend. Now, that's a lot of work. That's 6 hours a day of sitting, writing. That's grueling. That's a long time to sit and write, and that's a lot of work. But then they don't do it until the next weekend. So they don't have a habit. And by a habit, I mean like a daily regimen, a daily routine. And that's so important, not just for productivity, but of course that's the primary reason it's important, but also to keep you in that mindset. You need that edge. That writing, when you're in the zone, you have that edge. You probably know what I'm talking about. When you sit there, you have that edge. It doesn't mean the words just, magically flow. It means that you've got it under control. Even when you're not doing that well, you can muscle through it. You're in it. You're in that place that you need to be to write, and you can hold on to it if you have the habit. Very difficult to do if you don't develop the habit. Always going to have the work, but you also have to have it as a habit. So I didn't have the greatest habit at the time. Hard, but I allowed other distractions to get in because I didn't realize, look, I'm not always going to have 2 hours, 3 hours to sit down and write every night. I'm not going to always be able to do that. And I'm just going to need to pull back a little bit on my ambition or my expectation. And I learned like on the job. That's how we all learn. There's only so much you can learn from a book or from a teacher when it comes to writing. It's one of those things you learn by doing more than anything else. And only then do all the little things you picked up and gleaned from books on writing, all the little things, very helpful instructors have told you. Suddenly, you start seeing what little diamonds there were in those lessons and how they apply, and the light bulb comes on. And, it's like a little switch. I can remember, it was before I wrote Damnable, but I can remember that little switch coming on, though, of when I suddenly realized what reads as professional versus what reads as amateurish. I could point it out before then, sometimes, I think, but I could never quite be sure I was getting it right. And then suddenly I got it. Suddenly I could just tell. And could I explain it? Could I bottle it? No, I can't. It's just from doing it enough, you just get that little light bulb, like I said, comes on. So you develop that habit. I developed better work habits. I Diabolical, I wrote in a year, 12 months, which was the same kind of time, it took me to write Damnable. However, in writing Diabolical, I just had a better work regimen, and I didn't have to I didn't have to write as much each day. And that is the big thing. If you don't want to tax yourself, you don't want to drain yourself every day, you definitely don't want to get to the point where you dread that laptop. You dread because it's so psychologically grueling, to sit there because why? Well, you spent 3.5 hours, till 3 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning, the night before, after the kids go to bed, after you've gotten everything done, and you don't have it in you. You don't want to get to that point. So I have a personal minimum when I'm on my writing regimen, because I have to confess that I'm not always on my writing regimen because of other things. But when I'm on my writing regimen, which I try to be on as much as possible, I have a personal minimum of 500 words a day. It's very doable. In good circumstances, I can reach it in 45 minutes, sometimes a half an hour, if I'm really cooking. Most of the time, though, it's around 45 minutes to an hour. And I don't necessarily have to stop, at 500. And that's the beauty of it. You add to the minimum. But I can plan that way. If I have 500 word minimums, I know how long it's going to take me to write something at the worst. And I think that's a very helpful thing to have. If I were doing this without any other kind of job, without having a law practice, I'm sure I would have double that minimum and to 1,000. And
Sure.
That would mean I'd probably many, many, many days get 1,500, which is a really productive day. Because you look at it this way, 500 words a day. You did that for a year, you write 2 full novels. That's 2 full novels, right, at 500 words a day. So that's a very productive clip, even though it doesn't take that long each day. Yeah, you have to master as a writer the art of that compound, productivity there, adding the consistency of doing things every day like that. I think that's
and that's important for any writer, no matter what your day job or profession may be. For the last I guess 4 months or so, I've been working from home full time, and I know that a lot of people have said it, and I even said it myself, that man, if this is all I had to do every day, man, I could be so much more productive, and that's not true. You still get caught up in all the other stuff that has to be done, and
it's funny. Somebody once said, if you really need something done, ask a busy person to do it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
One thing I didn't mention, about my novel, I left a very large, prestigious law firm to go out on my own and basically hang out a shingle, just so I could have the freedom to structure my day to make sure I had enough time to write. And that was a big leap of faith there. I'll tell you.
Yeah.
But, I had too many obligations, too many responsibilities to just say, okay, I'm going to be a full-time writer now. But I did leave the security and comfort of a large firm to become a sole practitioner, just so I could have that autonomy, so I could write. So it was when I said I made the decision to be a writer, that's a decision right there. That's cutting off all options, for me. So that gave me, I'll tell you what it did more than anything else. It took away the excuse. I couldn't anymore say, oh man, I had to work at the firm 12 hours today. I just can't write tonight. I was the boss of me. So, the only person I had to blame anymore if I didn't get writing done was me. And that helped. That did help, I must say, because I couldn't point the finger at anybody else.
I think a lot of people, want to say they want to be a writer. They say they want to have success. They want to have this dream come true that a lot of people have, but they're not willing to feed the dream and to give it the attention that it needs, and to like you said, you make a very real and very tangible sacrifice, or at least a leap of faith. Mm-hmm. How important was that for you to kind of draw that line in the sand, kind of make a demarcation, say this is I'm gonna do this thing?
It was probably the determining factor, because it robbed me, like I said, of any kind of face-saving excuse. It took it away. I had no choice anymore, but to otherwise I'd have just, I just looked foolish to myself if nobody else. I left a big firm, hung out a shingle basically, took a few clients with me, restructured my entire professional life for this. I needed to do it, and not everybody's going to respond the same, and not everybody needs to take drastic action. To me, what would have happened if I didn't? I probably would have muddled through writing a lot of short stories, and maybe occasionally or eventually I may have written a novel possibly, but I would have had way too many excuses and way too much in the way of daily demands on my time that would have made it quite difficult for me to commit the kind of chunk of my life that writing takes. Writing takes a long time. Even doing that 500-word minimum, that's going to be on average an hour to an hour and a half a night. It's doable. It's very, very doable. But that adds up. That's a lot of time. You're at the end of the year, you're at 500 hours, and toward the end of your novel, you're putting in a lot more than that. As you start hitting that, stretch run there, that last lap, yeah. You start sprinting, and putting in all those reserves, and you're muscling through the stitch, in your side there to get it done, because you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. So that's a lot of hours. You're talking about, 500 hours probably a year, to maybe 1,000 hours a year. To give you an example, a big law firm is pretty happy usually when you bill 2,000 hours a year, and they are considered sweatshops, doing
wow.
that. You're doing, in addition to your, maybe another job, you're doing half that. So it's a big undertaking. It's a big time commitment. It's not to mention the psychological investment. You live with that novel. Even when you're not writing, your mind doesn't shut off. Those gears and flywheels are spinning still. And, my wife always, thank God she's also a writer. I'm married to Rhodey Hawk.
Oh, cool.
My beautiful, wonderful wife. Hi, Rhodey. She, thank God, is very understanding being a writer, but there are plenty of times we'll be driving along and she'll say something and then I'll say, oh, I'm sorry, what? She'll say, never mind. I know you're in your book. Because that's the way it is. You have to run through, what you wrote last night, what you're going to write now, what that next scene is. But one of the big leaps forward though that I had was when I realized, you need to sit down with a plan. That was probably, if there's any piece of advice, I can give it a writer out there, if there's any, aspiring young or newly published or writers out there wanting to, what can they do to bring themselves up to a professional level. I would guess that every writer does this, whether they admit it or not. Sit down knowing what you're going to write. Now, I say that after I gave that example of I sat down and wrote an opening scene, just wrote it off the top of my head. You can do that. Right. But after that, I knew what I was going to write. That's the key. After that was just something that I needed to nudge myself through. When you sit down, though, you don't want to go by the seat of your pants. It's going to end up being very inefficient, and it's going to read in a meandering, sultry way. You need to know what you're going to write. I'm not saying you need to have a precise outline of every single scene or the like, but I think you need to have a plan. You need to know, I want to get this character from, this point here to this point there, and that's what I'm doing right now. That's this scene. Just have a plan when you sit down, and that makes the time you spend there writing much more productive, and the finished product is much more readable.
That's great. So you've got the two novels, and you're continuing that series, the Jake Hatcher series, with a third this summer. But right now, you've got a brand new book out called American Nocturne, which is a collection of short stories with an introduction by Jonathan Mayberry that is excellent.
Yeah.
Tell me about this collection and where it came from, and kind of where all of these stories come from.
Well, I want to thank Jonathan Mayberry, for agreeing to write that introduction, and I was humbled when I read that.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
It's a brilliant one, and he was so almost effusive in his words for me. I was speechless really when I read it. He's a very accomplished writer, an iconic horror writer, and so if he's listening here, I want to give a shout out. Thank you, Jonathan. That was very, very kind of him to take the time, to do that. He's a busy writer. And he really liked those stories, and he wrote a great introduction, very entertaining, I think you'll agree, introduction. So where did American Nocturne come from? Well, I had published a number of short stories over the years since I had actually started becoming a published writer. And I started thinking about a year ago, I would say, I started thinking, I have enough stories here where I could put them together into something. But I did not want to just put together a collection of pre-published stories. What I realized, though, is that I had a certain core number of stories that shared a common theme, not a common setting necessarily, unless you count it as being, the United States, America, but a common theme, and this theme of a dark underside, mostly to human nature, and things not always being what they seem. And so I thought, I can put together some original stories here, building on this theme, and have a unified organizing principle here that I think will make a compelling collection. And I started thinking about, that organizing theme is dark, and so I toyed with this idea of, these could be in many ways considered sort of noir, not the classic noir, but the stories that I already had were noirish in a lot of their sensibilities, a lot of their features. So I actually sat down and thought about it and thought about titles for what a collection might be to try to envision, to try to get a grasp of this overall theme more concretely in my head. And I came up with the title American Nocturne. And immediately when I came up with that, I realized that was going to be the title story, the primary story to start things off. And I sat down and wrote that title story at that point, right then. And I wrote another story and one more after that, and I started looking these stories together, and I thought, I got something here. I got something here. And then I had a very it was not really fortuitous. I had a thought. I had another story that was not published. It was a Kolchak the Night Stalker story. Now, I had submitted this to an anthology many years earlier. Unbeknownst to me, that anthology, this is a Kolchak the Night Stalker anthology, an authorized Kolchak the Night Stalker anthology. Unbeknownst to me, they had a word limit of something like 3,500 or 5,000 words, something like that. And this was over 10,000 words, this story. And so I immediately got a call back that said, hey, everybody, when I say immediately, within days, I said, wow, everybody loves this story, but it's just too long. The publisher won't let us have it in there. Every story in here is like 4,000 or 5,000 words. And this is more than twice that. And I said, oh, and they said, but we'll keep you in mind. We'll keep in mind if we do another one. Well, they didn't do another one. So I had this story, and I realized, while this story is a little lighthearted, it's a good example of a very what's the word? There's a word I'm lurking for here that means lighthearted, but not quite the same. But it's a good example of how noir has seeped in to other aspects of popular culture. And Kolchak the Night Stalker had a lot of noir features to it. It was very ahead of its time. As many of your listeners, and you may know it, the X-Files, Chris Carter credits Kolchak the Night Stalker for inspiring the X-Files. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Joss Whedon credits Kolchak the Night Stalker for Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Clearly, you see in the show Supernatural, that probably traces its origins, to somebody being inspired somewhere along the line by the Night Stalker. That was a very influential, short-lived show back in the 70s, but it also had this noirish little aspect to it. And so I contacted Jeff Rice, the creator of Kolchak, who wrote the original novel, The Kolchak Papers, which became the movie, The Night Stalker, which became the series. And I was just in the process of getting permission to use this Kolchak, the Night Stalker story, and Mr. Rice died. He passed away right in this process. It was, I sent it, literally, this is how it happened. I sent a check in the mail, and I never heard anything. And then I got the check returned, and it said something like deceased, undeliverable.
Oh, wow.
I was stunned, and then I read that he had passed away right after I got the check, and so I managed to get in touch with his son, and he was now the owner of the rights, and he graciously gave me permission to continue what I had started there to use the story. So I owe him a debt of gratitude. And I put the story right in the middle here. I think of this, it is, if I recall, right in the middle of the collection. And I think it makes a very nice counterweight that just shows the breadth of noir. And that's the kind of the theme of this, the darkness. Because, noir just really means dark, black.
And that story is A Murmur of Evil?
Murmur of Evil, yes.
Yeah.
Here's the little sign-off signature point to this whole little anecdote about the Kolchak tale. Right after I sell this collection, and as it's all being finalized, I signed the contract. It couldn't have been 3 weeks later that I find out that the publisher of that prior Kolchak antho is doing a Kolchak the Night Stalker anthology, and they were assuming they were going to have my story in there, and I actually find my name associated with it online, and I was like, "What the heck is this?" And so I talked to them, and they were very good about it. They apologized. It had been many years. They just kind of thought, well, we got this story. This is good. I'll put this in here. And, I'm sure he'll be happy that he has a place for it, not knowing, I had already gone through all these lengths. So I told them what was going on, and, they were quite gracious about it. So anyway, that's how the story ends up in here. And, I'm getting lots of positive feedback on that story. I think people really like that story is just a surprise right in the middle, that they didn't expect.
Yeah.
And it's fully authorized, and I loved that show when I was a kid. I mean, I could not get enough of that show, even though it was only on one season. If there's anything that influenced me as a child more than that, I don't know what it is. Spider-Man maybe comes a close second.
I love it. And the collection is called American Nocturne. It's published by Cohesion Press, who is doing lots of awesome stuff in that space right now. And you've got this beautiful noir cover that really kind of sums up the essence of the collection, and is I couldn't think of a more perfect cover that you've got. It's really fantastic.
I'm glad you said that. Cohesion, I want to give a shout out to them. My publisher, Jeff Brown, my editor, Amanda Spedding. Very, very, very good people to work with. Very professional, are making sure they do everything right. And they are publishing other very good authors, very, very good authors, which is why I felt very comfortable going with them. They hired a professional cover artist who had worked with many major publishing houses. They went for high quality, and they asked me, any input. What would you like to see for the cover? And I said, I have an idea of maybe an alleyway, something that gives a noirish feel. And I said, tell them to think of the mood as something like, maybe Sin City meets Twilight Zone is just the atmosphere. And he came back with that, and boy, he nailed it.
Yeah, that's Sin City meets Twilight Zone all day long.
And I've gotten lots of compliments on that cover. So you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, obviously, but let's be real here.
Well, and more nowadays, that is patently false. A great cover on your book really means everything, especially in the Amazon world where so many buying decisions are made from a thumbnail.
Cool.
So having an iconic cover like that really means everything.
It's the first impression. It
is.
It's what's going to catch a reader's eye, and it's what's going to form their idea of what this book is, and make their decision.
Yeah.
Whether first they're going to buy it, and if they do, how are they going to go in? What are they going to go in feeling? And you really want to set the tone properly. So a cover is important. And I was very happy to see. My other suggestion is I thought of the words American Nocturne being in neon because of noir.
Yeah.
And they did it. So I was very, very happy. Cohesion is certainly trying to do right by this, and I'm very appreciative. Collections are tricky things. They're not novels. So you don't, it's like a box of chocolates. You don't know what you're going to get. But so far the reception has been very positive, and a lot of really, really strong reviews. I'm waiting on a couple of major outlets. Knock on wood, I've gotten some maybe third-hand information passed to me that two pretty high-profile outlets, maybe not the big major ones yet, but are also going to be giving it a positive review very shortly. So so far, I'm very, very happy that it's being so well received.
Awesome. Hank Schwaeble, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show this week. This has been an extremely fast hour, and I feel like we could probably do another 2 hours just diving into story. But tell everybody where they can find you and where they can find your work. And I'm going to put links in the show notes to American Nocturne and your other novels. But tell everybody where they can connect with you.
Sure. I'm in the process of updating my website. Major overhaul. So I don't expect anything right this minute, but in the next few weeks, I think you'll see a major new look. Did I say major? At hankschwaeble.com. But, my books are on Amazon. They're Barnes and Noble, pretty much anywhere, books are sold. You're going to be able to find, this, obviously Amazon is the big, gorilla that, you can find, most anybody there. And that's an easy way to do it. My first two novels are already out, Damnable and Diabolical. And, American Nocturne is just released, and the physical book, we staggered the release. Cohesion staggered it. So the ebook came out February 1st. And it's just a matter of days now before the paper version, trade paperback, is being released. And so you can get either of those, through the Cohesion website, through Amazon, various sundry other places.
Excellent. And I'll put links in the show notes to all those places where you can buy it. Thanks, Hank, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.